Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Chelsea Russell, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Canada. And I'm coming at you right now from snowy Toronto, Canada. So today I'm going to talk about something I'm calling a pattern in genealogical gacha. So, gacha systems that monetize more than the characters themselves, but also sort of the lineage. So, the ancestry, the inheritance, historical prestige. And so my case for this is the game Musume, Pretty Derby, where I think this pattern becomes especially visible because it's anchored in real world thoroughbreds, real world horses and pedigrees, and it's a widely sort of circulated sporting heritage. And it's also a game I've played a lot and every day, and so I'm very invested in this. So, just to begin, a lot of gotcha research begins with, I think, a pretty intuitive claim that gotcha sells access to these desired rewards via those repeated paid engagements with randomness. Gotcha becomes a sort of monetization category in its own right. And so, Uma Musume, I think, pushes us towards a little more of a specific observation. Sometimes what's being monetized, sorry, sometimes what's being monetized um, is anchored in the real world, at least in this case. And like I've said, it's anchored in real world pedigrees. And so the character's pedigree themselves becomes the configuration, the ancestry, the inheritance, which I'll get to a bit later. Those logics become purchasable inputs to optimization, turning heritage into like upgrade currency, right? So thinking about Musume as sort of pushing this answer one step further, because when you look closely at what players are paying for in this game, it's not just the sort of character as a discrete collectible. What's being monetized is the pedigree of the character themselves. So in other words, sometimes what gacha is selling is not just who you pull, but kind of where they come from, right? Like there's different ranks of the characters, which is common in gacha games. But in Uma Musume, the sort of ancestry and inheritance and historical prestige are layered on top of that system. So they're sort of built directly into the progression. And so this game repeatedly asks players to engage with lineage as a sort of functional input. And that's something that shapes like probabilities, outcomes, even long-term optimization strategies. So I'm asking us in this presentation to consider a more specific configuration than just paying for the characters. Instead, I'm asking us to think about gacha systems as heritage itself becomes valuable, it becomes currency. And that's what I mean when I say some gacha systems have heritage as like this upgrade currency. So I want to ask what happens when inheritance is monetized and when pedigree becomes something you kind of invest in and optimize through these gacha systems themselves. So I think what makes Uma Musume a pretty productive case for this analysis is how explicitly its character system is anchored in these real world thoroughbred genealogies. And you can see over here, I have a picture of the real world horses and their lineages and genealogies in real life, and then the anime characters in relation to it. So these characters aren't loosely inspired by racing culture or abstract ideas of competition. They are explicitly tied to named horses, recognized bloodlines, and historical racing narratives that already carry these cultural, economic, and effective weights outside of the game. So pedigree matters before play even begins. It arrives with this preloaded meaning, basically. And so that anchoring gives inheritance a really specific status inside the game. Because on one level, inheritance functions effectively and culturally. It draws on these familiar ideas of legacy, prestige, succession. You're encouraged as a player to understand, not just as you're controlling the character, but the lineage and how that affects things, right? So at the same time, though, Uma Musume is procedural. And so this game translates lineage into optimization. Traits are passed probabilistically, outcomes are shaped by ancestry, and progress depends on those repeated sort of training runs that attempt to produce those better descendants. And so I think what's crucial here is that these two dimensions operate simultaneously. So inheritance produces that emotional attachment and also that cultural meaning, but it also has those, like I said, those probabilities, those modifiers, and those outcomes that directly affect success and failure. So when real world pedigree is meaningful and mechanically consequential, heritage itself becomes like this economic resource. So that's why I think Musume functions as this really legible case, because it allows us to see almost in this really heightened form how gacha systems can monetize characters of power and the lineage of that power itself. Okay, so in this presentation, I operationalize this through three different things. The first is referential encoding. So real world genealogy and biography are translated into that character data and those collectible assets and things like that. And here on the screen, you can see two different famous horses in real life. And you can see this is taken in 97. And these are two horses that are very much used in the game. So Majira McQueen and Tokai Teo. So translated character data, collectible assets. Second is procedural inheritance. So progression depends on that probabilistic trait processing across those different generations. And then monetized access. So obviously the sort of gacha pulls, price discriminates access to better like ancestors, trading supports, effectively turning heritage into upgrade currency. And so the rest of this talk just kind of walks through those three moves and ends on kind of why they matter. So I'm going to get into each of these a little more deeply now. So just as a quick, methodologically speaking, I work in this project across a few different infrastructures of the game. So this means paying close attention to how lineage, inheritance, and progression are operationalized in menus, in trading loops, in banners, in reward systems, because they change over time. And that makes it possible to trace how heritage is translated into mechanics, right? Because different characters will achieve different ranks depending on what's now released. Like a character that might have been B rank is now S, right? And that just happened in the last one, actually. And then I'm looking at paratexts, so including posts and update communications to track how the developers frame this, how they frame lineage and training and progression, and how these new mechanics are justified or explained to players, right? And this is a particularly really interesting one because the third one, the Japan site, is far ahead of the English, and a lot of the English stuff is based on Japan. And so all of that, you can see the English language player spaces take a lot of what they know to be the future in Japan, as well as looking at the past in the 90s racehorsing scene to kind of optimize. And it's a really interesting kind of balance that you have to strike. So the sort of multi-sided ethnography across those different spaces. So fan wikis, a lot of Facebook posts, X and Twitter, Reddit. So looking across these different platforms to see how that knowledge circulates and how it's talked about. So going through for referential encoding. So this is the process in which real-world genealogy and biography are translated into game systems, into character data, strats, traits, rarity, tiers, collectible assets, all these things. And what's important isn't that it's a matter of referencing history. This game is gesturing towards race isn't gesturing towards racing culture necessarily. It's using it. It's being structured by it. You can kind of get a spoiler alert for the anime by an Excel sheet from the 90s because it follows it that closely. So lineage is part of the interface. It's legible inside it. Players can kind of see it in the player profiles. They can see it in the training support and optimization guides. And you can see here, I have a picture of one of the very popular optimization guides. And there's so many different types of guides here. So you can see that the quick access is there's a guide to the story, to the career, to the support cards, the skills over here. And there's a card tier list. There's a bunch of different characters and their rank. There's one specifically for Goldship, who, again, as I'll get to, there are specific character like fandoms too, right? As I'll get to that a bit later. But once genealogy is encoded in this way, it circulates as a collectible, right? It can be pulled and it can be duplicated and it can be ranked and it can be discussed. And so players learn to read heritage through the game categories. And so it's translating real world lineage into data and into assets. And then we have, after this, procedural inheritance, inheritance. And this is where the lineage sort of stops being just something you recognize and it's something you do at this point, you as an active trainer. So progression in the game depends on that probabilistic trait passing across generations, right? So ancestry doesn't guarantee outcomes, but if conditions, the chances under certain conditions, the chances under which outcomes emerge. So that creates a really specific kind of play loop. Rather than progression being that linear single arc, players are encouraged to rerun those training scenarios because they have to over and over again to produce that improved descendants. And each run generates slightly different results, and traits may or may not transfer, aptitudes may emerge in stronger or weaker forms, and success is always really partial for the most part. And so that makes an inheritance system a recursive system. Players don't play once and move on, right? They play, they evaluate the outcome, they learn from what went wrong or right, and then they try again because there's always a probabilistic nature to it. And I think a really crucial part of this repetition is that it's got this really dense layer of community authored optimization knowledge. It's got a lot of community authored guides and spreadsheets and calendars and probabilistic breakdowns, as you can see. All of this, like a lot of the way that people play, becomes something that's actively produced. It's generated through labor and evaluated through these metrics. And it's at this point that genealogy becomes really dynamic. So it's not something just encoded in the character, right? It's something that unfolds across time and across community spaces themselves. The third one then would be monetized access, of course, right? So this is the point where the previous two, the referential encoding, procedural inheritance, are folded into that revenue model that the game has. So gacha pulls provide that price discriminated access to better ancestors, right? To the S rank UMAs that you can pull, and the training supports that shape how that inheritance unfolds. So character pulls determine what lineages you can work with. Support card pulls determine how effectively you can train those lineages and how likely those desirable traits are to emerge. And so what matters is not that these systems exist, but how these systems interact. So like I said, it's probabilistic and it's recursive. Players already know that a single run is unlikely to produce like a perfect outcome, right? And so monetized access steps in and allows the players to sort of improve the conditions under which repetition happens. Better ancestors, stronger support, higher rarity, assets, they really tilt the odds. They don't eliminate your chance, but they really tilt that. And so this produces a really specific monetization logic, which is the sort of long horizon account building model. So spending is justified not just because you get that immediate payoff, but because now you have that promise of cumulative advantage over time. So it's like almost framed as an investment over time. Monetized access doesn't sit at the top of the inheritance system, it's kind of woven into it. So gacha becomes the mechanism through which heritage is accessed and refined. So I mentioned this earlier, but one risk with describing all this optimization is that it can sort of flatten play into pure calculation. And I think that's where things like your Oshis come in. So you as the player are not framed as that. You're framed as a manager. You're framed as a trainer. And that role comes with a really specific moral script. So trainers are expected to manage things like rest cycles, prevent injury, plan things really carefully, avoid pushing the characters too far. And so it's not framed as bad luck when your Umas get hurt. It's framed as you being a bad trainer. It's mismanagement. And as a result, success feels like significant, like you were optimizing things correctly. You were responsible and you're a good steward. Doing well means you're caring properly, you're caring correctly, right? And so players will frequently draw on idle fandom language, especially like Oshi, so a favorite character whom one actively supports. So it's not a passive preference, right? It implies commitment and loyalty despite their rank, right? And so the sort of media ecosystem reinforces that logic. You get concerts if you win. There's specific voice actor performances and the in-game sort of winning live sequences transform it into a spectacle. So why this matters? One implication is obviously political economic. The lineage loop sort of shifts horse racing, speculative logics away from that like gambling, wagering, state regulated into platform microtransactions. And that uncertainty and variance stay central, but they're resituated in this repeated effects and not in bets on races, but in your own microtransactions. And so conceptually, foregrounding this as a genealogical gacha gives us that vocabulary for analyzing how heritage works. So I just want to close with why this matters. Musume helps us see a pattern where gacha monetizes lineage, turns heritage into optimization as a resource, and it shows us how durable gacha attachment can be, produced at the intersection of that probabilistic optimization, care-based identification, and culturally specific heritage infrastructures. And these are two of my favorite horses, my Oshi's Gold Ship and Maya no Top Gun. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm always happy to take questions. Thank you.